Welcome to this week's show. My name is Qaiser Raja, and today we are going to talk with Mr. Jeffrey Young, who is an American politician, and according to his Twitter, or now X bio, he is anti-Western imperialism, and he is anti-war, and he is anti-war for some time, 1976 to be precise. And we are going to talk about the American interventionism in Middle East today, particularly in the ongoing Palestine-Israel conflict. So this conversation is set to be pretty exciting. Mr. Young, welcome to my show.
Thank you for having me on.
It's such a pleasure. Well, let's get right to it, shall we? You are a politician, and you are an American politician. So you understand American politics. You understand international relations. Now, the U.S. has been claiming that it has some kind of a de facto role to maintain the global order. But when it comes to the Middle Eastern conflicts, particularly the one which is ongoing, Palestine and Israel, well, it doesn't look like that the America is governing order. It looks more like the America is there to defend its own interest, and the interest of its ally, Israel, and it's defending the interests at the cost of human lives, children, women. What's your take on this?
I would agree. It's not the interests of the American people. It is certainly the interests of the ruling class, the largest corporations, billionaires, and what they perceive to be their interests, which is mainly acquiring more wealth. It's not in the interests of anybody else in the world. And so since World War II ended in 1945, the United States has been intervening all around the world, militarily, and also economically and diplomatically, to make American corporations more powerful and to make our billionaires even more wealthy than they were before.
Well, that's very true. And in this case, if we look at the American aid that goes to Israel, that is somewhere between $3.5 to $4 billion a year, 98% of which, according to the released figures, 98% of which goes to the the Israeli military, which ruthlessly is uprooting Palestinians who are living there for decades. Despite all the land which has been claimed by Israel already, it's the remaining lands. And we see a direct contrast of what America stands, or the American government, we should say, what they claim to stand for and what they actually deliver. But there's something very interesting you mentioned. I mean, there's a bit of nuanced point, but it sure is a very important point. And that is that if we are to say that the U.S. is defending its own interest, that itself is questionable in terms of how far can you go to protect your interests or that of the interests of your allies. But what you alluded to is that this is not even a genuine American interest. I mean, it's the people are not on board with this policy. It's just the government, which happens to be a ruling class, and it doesn't care about its own people and what they stand for, and it's doing it despite the American people not being with them, but they're still doing it for Israel. Did I get that point right?
I think you did. In addition to the government, we have a highly controlled mainstream media propaganda system.
Yeah.
I studied with Noam Chomsky at MIT, a couple of political science courses in 1976.
All right.
And he pointed out that what we see in the mainstream media is largely propaganda, heavily influenced by the national security state including the CIA. And so that helps the ruling class keep control in this country.
Right. You being a politician, obviously you are in the direct contact with the...
Censorship. I'm sorry, what?
Sorry, I was asking a follow-up question that you being a politician, obviously you are in direct contact with the general public. What sort of sentiment do you see in public? I mean, how far? I mean, look, 20 years ago, the general public wouldn't ask why America is going this far to help Israel and why is it going that far to help Israel against Palestinians. But with the advent of social media, where people are a lot more aware than they were, say, 2-3 decades ago, but what sort of sense do you see in American public, that is, if at all, that they don't like what their governments are doing and what they are willing to do about it?
Well, since October 7th, 2023, I believe the American people have become less sympathetic toward the Israeli government and more opposed to President Biden. I saw a survey yesterday that said Biden's support among Democrats has declined to about 50%, which is the lowest it's been. Well, when the question is, how is he doing in handling the conflict in Israel and Palestine, goes down to 50%. Last night, I was at a meeting of my church, the Lexington Friends meeting, or Quakers, where one of the other people in the church had invited 3 Muslim women from various parts in the Middle East. One was from Afghanistan. And they talked about their personal experience living here in Kentucky and following the genocide that's going on in Palestine right now. And so I think Americans some want to be educated. Some actually don't want to know anything other than what they've heard in the past. But a group of Quakers was interested in learning about it from people who actually have some experience.
Right. I mean, that's...
are in Palestine and so on.
And then that is sort of a beginning of a new paradigm. Every day, I mean, I do follow this topic with a lot of interest on social media, and on a daily basis, we see more and more people from the U.S. saying exactly what you just said, that we've been misled for decades, believing that the Palestinians were the bad guys and Israelis were the oppressed people, and this is the narrative that we have been sold to. But now that is not the case anymore, because we can see the truth. Now, a disturbing tactic there, and this is something I really need you to help us understand, because you've mentioned you've been with Noam Chomsky as well, so there's a lot of linguistic techniques used to promote a certain narrative here. So this is how the question goes. Typically speaking, countries, almost all countries, they get involved in some anti-humane practices. They commit some kind of extremism, war crimes, you name it. There are different ways of going about it. But when they are called out, mostly they are rather quick to shut down those operations and to come up with some sort of face-saving tactic. But what we see almost at unprecedented levels at the current conflict, that there is no way by which Israel can present itself as as the good guy. There is no way that with all the might of the Western media that historically is pro-Zionist, there's no way by which they can present Israel as the good guy. So what they've started doing is they've started inviting ruthless, merciless speakers like Ben Shapiro, like Douglas Murray, and a number of other people to justify what they're doing. So typically speaking, what we see is that the people are very quickly to remove themselves. Countries are very quick to remove themselves from those allegations. But in here, not only they are engaging with them, they're embracing them, but they're also justifying them. So when you tell them, for example, that the ratio between the civilians and Hamas operatives is 100 to 1. So you kill 100 civilians, including children, including pregnant women, including the elderly, including non-combatants. Obviously, they are civilians. And you kill 100 of them, and then you get to a Hamas operative. And when you present these figures to them, they don't shy away from saying that, yes, we are doing it. But they're saying, well, we are doing the right thing. They come up with some sort of justification. What do you make of this? I mean, this is a very dangerous development because they're no longer removing themselves or distancing themselves from this. They are saying, yeah, we are doing it, whatever. That is sort of language has been used.
Well, various groups of people. I was born and raised Jewish in Massachusetts, moved to Kentucky in 1982. And the Jewish community here in Lexington, Kentucky, has pretty much come down on the side of we must stop anti-Semitism around the world. We must support Israel. But I know for a fact that there is disagreement within the Jewish community. So I recently attended a seminar at the local temple, and the ground rules at the beginning of the session were that we weren't going to talk about politics because it was so divisive. So they talked about history and so on. So the Jewish community is split in this country. Some have become outspoken advocates of ceasefire and settling the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through negotiations to achieve either a one-state or two-state solution. Jewish community is divided, but the people that get on the media are those who we just support Israel right or wrong. So it's a mixture now happening now. Some people try to justify it somehow, and others are actually demanding a change in Washington.
What about your own party, Mr. Young? You're a Democrat. Historically speaking, we see that the Republicans, they are deemed more of people who take the direct approach, and they are a bit more to the point that, yep, we are doing it. That's what it is. Whereas, the Democrats are seen more of people who are more flexible in their approach, more, willing to listen to to reason. The language they use is not Trump-like. It's not inflammatory. But what Joe Biden is doing, maybe he is not using as flamboyant of a language as Trump does, but for all practical purposes, it looks like a policy hijack. I mean, it's very difficult right now to see who is in power in the U.S., and I understand that Israel is America's ally. We know Joe Biden from his rather young days. He's been a staunch advocate for Israel. But obviously, you take the party lines, and there are few lines you don't cross. But with Joe Biden, you don't see that. It almost looks like that there is a Republican in power, doesn't it?
Well, it depends on which country we're talking about.
Yeah.
The war in Ukraine, the Democrats were slightly more pro-war than the Republicans. And now that the attention has shifted to Israel, it seems that there are a tiny bit more Democrats who favor a ceasefire. I think 24 yesterday signed a letter to President Biden asking him to ask Israel to cease fire and so on. But in general, both parties are identical on foreign policy, with just a few dissenters around the edges.
Right.
The U.S. foreign policy has been imperialistic, aggressive, violent, warlike. I would say ever since 1950, when the United States intervened in Korea and committed genocide against the people of South Korea and North Korea. Something like 3 or 4 million Koreans murdered by U.S. and their allies in Korea. Moved on to Vietnam, which was about 4 million Vietnamese, South and North, also Laos and Cambodia. So the United States foreign policy has been bipartisan since the end of World War II. And it's not even worth talking about the tiny number. Rashida Tlaib today is standing for a ceasefire and being condemned by her colleagues, especially Republicans. So I don't see any movement yet in Washington. The new Republican Speaker of the House is savage Christian Zionist. And, it's going to take a while to change Congress and change the mass media here.
Well, that's an interesting point, that there are people within the Democratic Party who are encouraging the president to act for ceasefire. But there are early calls, and I know this is a very dangerous idea. It certainly is not suitable in a democracy, but I'd like to take your view on this. Now, there are some calls that, despite the historical disdain towards McCarthyism, which was focused on the elements of communist elements within the American policy, now there are calls now that if the U.S. government is so heavily under the influence of Zionism, and the Zionists who run the American policy, particularly when it comes to the Middle Eastern affairs, then maybe we need another McCarthyism in the U.S., but for this time to purge the American politics of the Zionists. And I accept it's a very dangerous idea. I don't think it is always going to be it's going to be healthy, an operation like that. But what if you disagree with this idea? Then what other options do you see by which the American policy can become pro-America again, as opposed to pro-Israel, even if the cost of that is going against America's own people? What are the other avenues that can be taken within the American politicians to bring the American policy back to line?
Well, usually my first response to any outrage committed by our government or our government's alliances with other countries, my first response is always impeach the president.
Right.
And And I go on to say, impeach the president for his or her war crimes alone. The United States has been contemptuous of international law since World War II ended. And so every president, I learned from Noam Chomsky, has been a war criminal in terms of committing the supreme international crime, which is international aggression, regime change, or overthrowing elected governments or non-elected governments, installing dictators all over the world. Every president from 1946 till today has been a war criminal, including Trump. And so the answer for Americans, voters, is always impeach the president for his war crimes. We get the next president in, the vice president, in this case, Kamala Harris. If she doesn't stop committing war crimes all over the world, impeach her next. Then impeach the Speaker of the House if he becomes president. Then impeach the next one in line until the deep state gets the message. Violate international law, commit mass murder, commit genocide, commit aggression, and you get impeached. That's the only strategy I've been able to come up with in the last 50 years.
That is, it's a good idea. It is. Well, I mean, look, it is there to uphold the rule of law, so I don't think there is anything intrinsically wrong with it. But when it comes to the practical application of it, the impeachment obviously will not be done directly by the American voters. The democratic institutions have to be employed, and they are part of the process. But what do we do when in those institutes we have people so hot-headed and so much excited with war that even if you ask for a ceasefire, you are slapped with the label of being an anti-Semitic person? Do you see this likely happening, that presidents can be impeached because they commit or support international war crimes?
Obviously, it's not practical today.
Yeah.
But during the Vietnam War, we had a very strong, vocal anti-war movement. And sure. I think more than anything else, America needs another anti-war movement like the 1960s.
Yeah.
And in that context, it will be possible to start holding the president and, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense responsible for war crimes if we have a large mass movement against war and imperialism.
Right,
it's going to take a while.
It is going to take a while, but obviously you have to make a start at some point. Do you think that in encouraging American voters through the awareness campaigns, that if they can put enough pressure on their government to at least stop aiding Israeli military, which is at the forefront of committing a genocide or at least war crimes, would that be a good start?
That's certainly a step forward. Yeah, I mean, the more attention is focused on Israel's ongoing genocide and the United States' blind support for that, the better. And we have an entire worldwide movement now for Palestinian rights. It's stopping the killing. So, with the internet, it's been much easier to get actual videos of what's going on in the Gaza Strip, and that goes all around the world. And so we can look at all of the, the NATO countries, the United States, Australia, all of the governments that currently are okay with genocide, right before our eyes. They're all coming under pressure. Now they
That's very
say
true.
boycott movements. Various multinational corporations, Starbucks, McDonald's, are being boycotted in Asia because they are not supportive of the Palestinian cause.
Yeah.
I just
Okay.
see a lot of momentum in the positive direction.
Well, I had one last question, but you just mentioned something very important, so I'd like to squeeze this one in before I go to the last question. You mentioned that the boycott in Asia and in many of the parts of the world, the McDonald's and Starbucks, and a number of other companies. What sort of impact do you see? That boycott. Is it impactful? Is there a conversation within the U.S. that um, the boycott itself? I mean, I guess what I'm trying to ask is, how do you think this boycott is helping the Palestinian cause?
Well, if it's true that multinational corporations are very influential in Washington, that it seems like a practical way for the people of the world, we don't want to see genocide going on, to influence Washington by boycotting these corporations,
Right.
pressuring them to actually take a position in support of the Palestinian people. And so we can pressure our and aid for members of Congress by taking business away from these companies that are trying to sell products and sell their services in the global South, and pressure the government indirectly that way.
Okay, this is great to hear that the sentiment like that is there in the U.S. One final question: what do you see the best solution? How do you think the current issue, the conflict between Israel and Palestine, can be resolved, making sure that Palestinians, they get their fundamental human rights and their state? How do you see the best way to resolve this issue?
Well, there has to be a ceasefire first. There has to be humanitarian aid uh, allowed to enter to save the Palestinians from starvation and dying of thirst and, just being killed off. And Israeli troops all need to withdraw from the occupied territories.
Yeah.
That's going to take international pressure against Israel.
Right.
And then there has to be an international peace conference with Israel on one side of the table and the entire world on the other side, except for the United States, NATO, the Five Eyes countries.
Yeah.
Excluded. Have to exclude the United States from the negotiations and have the entire global South lined up against Israel. And what I think needs to happen, or may actually happen, is that the world presents Israel with a choice. One state solution, where everyone in historic Palestine has equal rights. Palestinians would sooner or later vote their way into power. That would cease to be a Zionist country, would cease to be a Jewish state, or the two-state solution, where it's divided in some boundary line, and the occupation.
Right.
And those are the only two options on the table, and Israel has to pick one of them and implement it. That's the only strategy I've heard that actually solves this problem.
Oh, that's fantastic. I mean, I think it's very sensible. It's workable. Thank you, Mr. Geoff Young, for your precious time. It has been very insightful, and I'm very sure that it will help our audience get more educated on what is happening. Thank you so very much indeed for your time.
It's been a pleasure talking with you. Thank you.